Hi everyone, Angela here, and it's Good Friday. So here's a major part of the reason why we are who we are. Because of course I'm talking about Jesus' death. Because as we know, because it's Good Friday, the gospel for today is the story of Jesus' passion. So we start off in the garden, his betrayal, go through his different trials, we're taken with him to the cross until ultimately he's placed in the tomb. And it makes you wonder, what were Jesus' last thoughts as he went through all of this? If he was even thinking at all. I mean, I imagine such an intense situation, he probably didn't even have the capacity to think, and rather he just felt in the most extreme way. Because of as much as we know the story of Jesus according to John, and John portrays everything in light of the resurrection, here I don't believe that Jesus knew that resurrection would have followed. In a sense where, I mean, I'm sure he would have believed in a resurrection. Yet at the same time, at least what I would imagine the human response would be to this situation here, he would be reminding himself, okay, after this is resurrection. After this crucifixion is resurrection. And yet there's nothing like that, no kind of rhetoric like that from Christ. Instead, because he was silent for a lot of it, but when he would speak, John portrays Christ as a man who was nothing less than absolutely resolute and trusting in the one who would have sent him. And it's so heartbreaking that Jesus ultimately became a victim to everything he was trying to change. In the sense where he tried to bring about reconciliation and healing to those who were isolated. And at this part of the story, he was isolated. He worked for justice for those who were treated unjustly. And at this part of the story, he is treated unjustly. He brought life to death and to death dealing situations. And in this part of the story, he himself is being put to death. And I mean, we all have our different thoughts as to why the crucifixion would have happened. And we always talk about how, because Jesus was fully human and fully divine, when we look at the human part, we say he was human like us in all things except sin. And I feel like to say that is because we look at his life and come to the understanding that only a sinless person could have operated the way Jesus did. Like only a sinless person could have had compassion the way Christ would have had. Because sin so often has us studying ourselves that we can't look to the other and genuinely, as we know Jesus would have done, empty himself for the other, right? That selfless way that he would have lived, because he would have lived his life as a sacrifice, I would have said in the previous reflection. And here now we see in the extent of that sacrifice, how far he was willing to go for the good of humanity. And, we spend so much time like arguing and quarreling and fighting amongst ourselves when ultimately what I believe Christ wants for all of us is nothing more than for us to unite. Because so many faith traditions center on him. So, like, of course, I'm going to talk here about Christianity in general. But I mean, so many different world religions, regardless Christian or not, so many believe in the presence of the divine and oneness with the divine. And then for us as Christians, we get to see that too and experience that through the person of Jesus. And I mean, we're all family, right? So yeah, families will argue and quarrel and fight with one another. But at the end of the day, the basis of all of that is love. The same way for us too, as one human family, the basis of all our relations with one another should be love as well. This love that we see here, that had Jesus so willing to go through what he did because he trusted in the one who would have sent him. And it's especially cruel that of all the way Jesus died was through crucifixion. I mean, besides the fact that it was the Roman death penalty and it was for people who, well, for many different people like murderers and whatnot, and people who stood up for injustice, or stood up against injustice rather. The reason it's especially cruel is because the way crucifixion puts someone to death is not through blood loss the way many of us might think. It's not through the overwhelming pressure and the pain, but rather is strangulation, asphyxiation. And if we believe from the beginning that God would have breathed God's Spirit into us, God gave us God's own breath, then for Jesus to die the way he did is because they were literally trying to take the breath of God out of him. How do we take the breath of God out of God? And I suppose ultimately we can't, right? Because as much as we have the spoiler alert of what comes days from now, at this time, I'm sure it was nothing less than absolute and total despair. This despair that we see all throughout the world today. And I mean, I look at, of course, the situation here in Trinidad and Tobago, especially when it comes to gun violence, and I would add in even domestic violence as well. When we look at what's going on in Haiti, and not just what's going on now, because we always have something to talk about when it comes to Haiti and how much of an unjust situation Haiti always finds itself in. When we look at the situation in Ecuador, when we look at Ethiopia, Sudan, so many different parts of Africa, and we look at, of course, Gaza, right, Ukraine. I mean, I could go all over the world, right? Yet at the same time, if I were to name all the injustices, it would take me from now until Easter of next year before I could even begin to make a dent in that list. All over the world, so much injustice. Same injustice that Jesus would have gone through. And, there's so many people that have been blessed by God with all this different potential, and they are gone too soon. Same way as Christ too. Christ didn't die a natural death, and so many people are not afforded the dignity of dying natural deaths. And why? Over things like power and greed, money. I mean, I can name out all, as many Catholics would like to categorize them, as these deadly sins, yeah? But that's where our hope comes from as well. As ironic or paradoxical as it may seem. Because if God could go through this and we know what follows, then we also know what will follow any unjust situation that we may witness as well. So it just makes me wonder, if we knew it was our last day, the way Jesus knew his time was coming to an end as well, or at least in this capacity, how would we respond? What would we do? And I'm going to go back a little bit because when I would have preached last week, so in my reflection for Palm Sunday, when I recorded that video, I was a little hesitant and a little unsure in terms of whether or not I should have said what I said. Because I came on with some strong language at some points, especially talking about the gun violence and likening it to crucifixion, right? I mean, all the suffering in the world, we could liken it to crucifixion and God's breath being taken from people. And then tell me why. Because every Friday morning at 9 a.m. is when I would put my reflections up. Less than an hour later, I'm reading the news that a friend of mine also died to gun violence as well. A person who I've known years. I mean, we grew up in school together. And that's when I came to the realization, this is why I said what I said. This is why what I said needed to be said and continues to be needed to be said. So, whereas Max and so many people, y'all are the victims of unjust systems. And we as a Christian people, we as a human family, we need to do our best to try to work for the justice that these things don't happen. Because this is not the will of God. This could never be the will of God. So as I'm closing off today, I would like to honor Max and remember a quote that he would have said in one of his songs because he was a brilliant artist. And I never met someone who had such mastery of the English language and who was able to manipulate words and create such messages that it could have sometimes been like a quadruple entendre. So, according to Max, he said once, a man lives his whole life based on faith, but the outcome be determined by the choices you make. Same way that Max was a person who he loved life and he inspired a lot of people. He definitely inspired me. Jesus as well. He loved life and he would have inspired so many people and continues to inspire so many people. I mean, billions, right? And that's billions presently, not counting the 2,000 years of history that we already have. And that's why we know that Jesus' life didn't end in death, but rather it transformed and culminated in resurrection, a resurrection that we are all called to share in. So, as much as there's so much suffering and injustice in the world, we can trust and believe that this is not the end of our story. We can trust and believe that God is very much with us as we continue to be crucified day after day, month after month, year after year. We can trust and believe that in a few short days, resurrection will follow. At least as a God that I choose to believe in, this God of hope, this God of justice, this God that sees all and ultimately makes everything right. You mightn't feel it in the moment, but I believe that this is the God that we follow. So, in the middle of the Triduum now, it's Good Friday, and again, because we have the spoiler alert, we make our way towards the resurrection. That same resurrection that we spend our whole life making our way towards. So I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you soon. Thank you.